So the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, did something quite unusual today, and he made a visit to a nuclear-armed submarine. And then, not only that, but Downing Street released its own publicity pictures of Sir Keir strolling about the deck and holding binoculars and so on. What are they up to? What message are they trying to convey, and why? That's one of the questions we're going to be asking on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And joining us is Lucy Fisher, Whitehall editor at the Financial Times and host of their Political Fix podcast. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, James.
And Stephanie Flanders, who is head of economics and politics at Bloomberg, and not to be outdone, host of the Trumponomics
We've all
podcast.
got one.
We've all got a podcast.
Very good to be here.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Right, first of all, how much is there to talk about this week? Let's talk about defence, first of all. I've been struck, Chris, by this idea that there are almost two Keir Starmers at the moment, two prime ministers. One playing the role on the international stage and talking about Ukraine in particular, and generally that being pretty well received. And then the other Keir Starmer, the domestic Keir Starmer, facing quite a lot of pressure and quite a lot of scrutiny back home. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think what we've been seeing from the Prime Minister today, on Thursday, and indeed really over the last couple of weeks, is an attempt by him and his team to tie those two things together. How is he trying to do that? To make an argument, and this is a phrase or words to this effect that he and his team have said repeatedly, that in their view, national security is economic security. So a big part of this argument he's made today, as he's been in Barrow in Cumbria and then in North London, is pointing to, particularly on the trip to Barrow, hugely important base there, that the future of so many highly skilled, secure, long-term jobs can be in a country that is going to be throwing a lot more money in the direction of defence, both in the short, medium and longer term. And then I guess the political strategy underneath that is that, yes, there's been a pretty bumpy start in those first few months. The government seems to be finding more of its feet in the last few months since Christmas, and that the conduct of the Prime Minister on the international stage has been widely recognised as being in the kind of right place. So I guess he's trying to tie those two things together as he kind of reshapes how the next few years might look, given the international backdrop, and given that, you know, if you're getting praise in one side of the ledger, you try and tie that praise to the other side that's been tougher. And
you mentioned that trip to Cumbria today by the Prime Minister on board a nuclear submarine. Lucy, you used to be a defence correspondent. It's not every day the PM jumps aboard a nuclear sub, is it?
No, and I thought it was a pretty impressive media clip put out by Downing Street, Hans Zimmer style, filmic score to the backdrop of him with his arms rolled up as he strolled through the submarine's corridors and was seen kind of looking at all the hardware on it. What I would just say is, while I think it obviously makes sense to play into him being this, real statesman on the world stage, and of course he is playing this leadership role. He convened 30-odd political leaders who want to be part of this coalition of the willing supporting Kyiv at the weekend. As Chris said, on Thursday, he headed to Northwood, the UK Armed Forces headquarters in Hertfordshire, to meet lots of the senior military planners from those countries to talk about this pivot from the political concept to the military operation that might result in Ukraine following any ceasefire. I would just introduce a note of scepticism about how far the defence spending announcement he's made goes. It is only 6 billion odd extra in 2 years' time. And because I used to be a defence correspondent, I speak to lots of people in defence industry who say, look, that'll fill the black hole in the existing MOD plan. It's not enough to buy a lot of new kit. And look, this is extra money in 2 years' time. We need the orders now, not just the signal to industry to step up defence manufacturing capacity, which takes time. You need to build the factories. You need the skills pipeline of people learning many highly skilled roles like engineering and welding and so forth in order to be prepared. So it's not all it seems on the surface would be my warning on that.
And Stephanie, is this just something that we in the UK need to prepare ourselves for, just the start of an increase in defence spending? Is this what the future looks like?
I mean, I think we're clearly looking at a situation where we're going to be running up defence spending and needing to find ways to pay for it. And I guess I think to plant the idea in people's minds that it can also be contributing to growth. I completely agree. The numbers don't add up on that. It's not going to be transformative on that front. But I think it sort of preempts that possible discussion, which, you could always get into of, why are we paying too much attention to the rest of the world? Why are we suddenly embracing the kind of foreign policy vision when there's so many problems here at home? I think it helps to bridge that, if it's even just rhetorically, even though we know it's not going to really contribute to growth just in the next few years. And
I think what we're going to get next week when we get this spring statement from the Chancellor is an attempt to articulate exactly that argument. So I think there'll be a big focus on defence, not least because I think they are aware in government that they found a solution for this round of increase in defence spending in terms of shaving it off overseas aid. But if they're going to win an argument domestically into the medium and long term, this government and future ones, you've got to start a conversation with the country about the trade-offs to get to that, because you can't take much more off international development. You're going to have to think about other things, and I think we'll get a fair chunk of that in the rhetoric around what the Chancellor will say next Wednesday.
And there will be bills to pay quite soon, because there's a lot of talk about Ukraine and what the UK's involvement might be on Ukraine. And I see just in the past few minutes, Lucy, your paper is reporting that the Prime Minister has shifted his focus in his language from talking about boots on the ground in Ukraine to air and sea defence. I mean, even preparing for that is going to be expensive.
Well, it certainly is. And I think it's a really interesting strategic shift in what this coalition of the willing might be looking to do on the ground in Ukraine, because there have been these question marks about how this would work if the US were not prepared to provide air support, air cover, probably fast jets, as well as access to satellites and so forth. And all the mood music from Donald Trump has explicitly been that he does not want to have military involvement in any kind of coalition of the willing in Ukraine itself. There's also Russia pushing back very heavily, red line for Vladimir Putin, the idea of there being any European personnel based in Ukraine, even temporarily. And of course, the complexity of having a multilateral military deployment. So it feels like this meeting at Northwood could be quite a moment in the shift of what this coalition looks like.
Yeah, well, talking of the Prime Minister and talking of him talking, let's hear him talking now.
What we're doing today is moving from the political momentum that we had at the weekend, where we had leaders of a number of countries coming together, to the military planning. So that's what's happening at headquarters today. Going from the concept to the plans, and in particular looking at the question, how do we keep the skies and the seas and the borders safe in Ukraine?
And what that means, Stephanie, is spending money now.
Well, yeah, but also getting your act together. I mean, it is obviously enormously in their interests to look serious and to sort of answer the people who say, yes, they're just, it's a classic Europeans, talk about wanting to do stuff but can't actually do it in practice. There is an enormous risk hanging over this whole process, not least that the president is going to do, if there is a deal, it probably will bear no relation to the kind of planning scenario that the Europeans are using at the moment. So then there'll be a question for the Europeans, what do they do?
Because Donald Trump's unpredictable.
A little bit unpredictable, at least, but although kind of he's been a little bit predictable recently in following President Putin's view on an awful lot of these key issues. So there is that risk. I think the bigger risk, and they're obviously very mindful of it, and it's very hard to get around it, is, Donald Trump is clearly setting himself up for doing exactly what he did in Afghanistan in this case as well. You declare victory on the deal. In the case of Afghanistan, it was, I've done the deal with the Taliban on the withdrawal of US troops, and then you're able to actually distance yourself from the failure of actually how impossible that was to implement. I think the risk is that happens here because he's putting all of that on the Europeans, but they're not going to be part of actually the deal making. So I think it's great that they're doing all this stuff, but I think the serious serious heads in the defence industry and across Europe are saying they still do not have the capacity to pull this off effectively.
And Chris, you were in Washington not that long ago with the Prime Minister. Stephanie's got a good point there, doesn't she? That this is not necessarily a normal scenario where the UK government, or indeed any other European government, is in the room in the same way they might be at other times, or is that overstating how much they're in the room with the US in the first place?
I think it's broadly that, and it's exactly the point that Stephanie was making, that not only that, but you have, if you like, the conversation that's going on between Washington and Moscow, and with Kyiv in the mix as well, with the conversation going on alongside that, which is the argument we've heard from Donald Trump for years now about Europe upping its game on defence. But then, actually, can you implement the very thing that we arrive at? And how much preparation for that can you do in advance when you're waiting to see what that deal might look like? And then do you have the capability to actually then pull that off when there are so many people around the table who are saying, well, we're willing to contribute in this way, but not in that way. And how does that match up with the country that's willing to do this and all of that? And then you throw into the mix, which I know you've been looking at, Lucy, the whole question of the interaction between the likes of the UK and the European Union.
Yeah, I've been really interested this week on how, in some ways, the worsening security crisis in Europe has meant a more favourable backdrop for the UK kind of resetting its relationship with the EU. And yet this big spanner in the works yesterday when the EU announced the rules for its big new pot of defence expenditure, £150 billion worth, and it will not allow the UK or, to be fair, other non-EU countries, their arms companies to benefit from that expenditure, which really shows that while the UK and France look to be working well together as the leaders of this coalition of the willing, the age-old Anglo-French rivalry is alive and kicking.
And the impact of Brexit.
And the impact of Brexit, because of course it is France that is saying, we don't want to sort of allow the EU to sign a new defence and security pact with the UK until we sort out all the other Brexit headaches. Let's talk about fishing rights and everything else up front.
And deja vu.
Yeah, exactly.
So just to be clear, on one hand, France is saying we can't do the security pact, and on the other hand, France is saying to the UK, you can't be involved in this until we've done the security pact. Is that
Exactly.
right? Right.
That's the quandary right there.
There were mutterings. I mean, at that moment where the sort of, there was a great sort of, all the arms around Zelensky and all of that, as part of that weekend where the Europeans came together and showed great show of force, there was even some noises coming out of Paris that actually the French might actually drop fishing for a bit. They would actually allow Britain to talk about other things without talking about fish. And we all kind of looked at each other and said, yeah, that's not going to last. And sure enough, the fish are back.
Well, let's throw another Prime Minister into the pond or the ocean or whatever it is. And that's Mark Carney of Canada, who came to the UK this week to meet the Prime Minister and King Charles. What do you think, Stephanie, about Canada's role in all of this?
I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, when you talk about the coalition of the willing, the Canada's in the coalition of the willing to be rude to Donald Trump and actually say, sort of take him on. And Mark Carney's kind of been very forward-leaning this week, and we were writing stories about him wanting to have closer defence ties, link-ups with Europe. And the funny thing is, the feeling is they could actually do a Canada-EU defence agreement very quickly. No fish to get in the way. And so actually the Canadians, having said they might cancel some of their US fighter contracts kind of quite aggressively, could actually be in line for some of this funding. So there's kind of a further twist to that.
Right. Well, let's leave defence for a minute and move on to the yet another huge announcement this week, Chris, that you've been very, very much involved, you've all one way or another been involved in, and that is the announcement surrounding changes to benefits to welfare being proposed by the UK government. Very briefly, why don't you remind us what we're talking about?
So we're talking about the desire of the government to shake up the benefit system in order to do two things as they see it. One is to save money, because the numbers, the charts, if you like, are just going off the scale. And then secondly, to try and this is the age-old challenge with welfare reform, try to ensure that the system has the sufficient motivations built into it that those who might be able to work are encouraged to do so rather than disincentivised from doing so. The particular concern within government is the rising number of people who are who are not able to work because of ill health, mental or physical ill health. And how do you change the system so it doesn't incentivize people to make a rational decision to ensure that they can make a case that they're sufficiently unwell to work, because you get more money from that by tweaking the system so that is not the case. So that's what we've had from the Work and Pension Secretary, trying to save over the next handful of years between £5 and £6 billion, throwing about £1 billion back into the idea of trying to encourage people back into work. And where, broadly speaking, the opposition parties, not at least the Conservatives, are not making a first principles criticism, but saying maybe you could have gone further.
But there has been criticism, there has been opposition, not least within the Labour Party, particularly to two ideas: making it harder for some disabled people to claim benefits and making it impossible for some people under the age of 22 to claim benefits, Lucy.
Yes, backbenchers, some of them up in arms, even some members of the cabinet, who've raised concerns about this plan. They think it goes against traditional Labour values to look out for those worst off in society. Concerns raised in the House of Commons about the idea of people who are disabled or otherwise facing, huge health problems, being pushed into destitution, even potential for seeing an uptick in suicides of people who have their benefits removed. So it's felt a very, very knotty political row. And of course, it comes off the back of the aid cuts, as Chris pointed out, cuts to the winter fuel allowance, a suggestion this is a government that is sort of tacking rightwards, focusing on quite hardline rhetoric on immigration. And the soft left and the left of the party is feeling really out of sorts.
Is that a serious problem for Keir Starmer, given his majority, though?
Well, I think it is a problem for him coming down the road. These are welfare changes that will require legislation. This week, we've just heard the proposals in a green paper that will lead to a white paper, which will lead to legislation. So there will be votes in the House of Commons. And I think that there is this sense that there's an uneasy truce right now between his backbenchers and Downing Street, but they are going to be back in their constituencies this weekend. I'm sure there'll be an influx in surgeries and in the inbox about concerns about these changes. And of course, what happens with councillors? The leader of Dudley, Labour member for 40 years, has quit. Some suggestion we could see mass resignations in the local government level of the Labour Party ahead of the local elections on May the 1st.
But, Stephanie, is it the case that the hard economic reality facing the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is that the benefits bill is dramatically rising and forecast to dramatically rise even further?
I think the sheer numbers and also people's sort of anecdotal knowledge, if you ask anybody, they've all got some story, some relative who's doing something that they think is unreasonable.
Can I dive in just to say that David Lammy in the cabinet brought up that he thought one of his relatives was claiming benefits and shouldn't be.
I mean, but I think, so I'm going to differ a little bit, because I think, with these things, they're always potentially a nightmare. Any change you make to the benefit system, there's people with enormous amounts at stake, their livelihoods at stake. The issue is whether you get credit as a government for tackling a really big problem, trying to tackle a really big problem. It's only going to be the first bite, or blamed for just the sort of implications of what you've done and the particulars of what you've done. I think they've done quite a good job of fixing in people's minds how enormous this problem was, how it had not been addressed in the previous 10 years, and that difficult choices were going to have to be made. And it is an area where, Labour activists are often on a different side from the broader public. I think on this, they definitely are on a different side. The broader public agree that this is out of control. Now, whether these particular measures are going to work or will raise even as much as the relatively small amount in the scale of things that is suggested is another question. But I think they've done quite well to put it out there.
Couple of things on that. So ministers do take some comfort from where they perceive public opinion to be in the round. Anecdotally, I was in Gravesend the other day in Kent talking to folk about all of this, and
in a cafe.
I was indeed in a cafe, an entirely random little snapshot.
Hope
of
you got a nice cup
public
of tea.
opinion. I did.
Despite being so far south.
Yes, indeed. And folk were, volunteering to start naming their neighbours. As I'm wandering around with the camera. Oh, I could tell you about person at number. Well, let's not get into names, but I can hear your sentiment. So there was that. Then the other point we should mention in this context is that this isn't about cutting the benefits bill. It is about slowing the rate of its increase. So, which speaks to that challenge of those charts and where those numbers are projected to go, even accounting for these changes. Oh, and one other little nugget is that we will get on Wednesday the impact assessment that the government has done around, well, exactly that, what impact they assess that this will have. Now, so MPs will get a sense from their constituents, and they tell me that they'll hear both things, by the way. They will hear people who are worried, maybe recipients who fear that their money's going to go or decline, but also those who say too right too. But we haven't yet got published, the government's got it, but we haven't yet got their estimates as to the precise consequences of this.
Oh, and just to be clear for someone who is not a day-to-day Westminster person, when you say an impact assessment, is that a budgetary assessment? Is it a human level? To what extent does it get into the human effect as much as the balance effect?
These things can vary, but it's
line.
both in this instance.
Right.
So it's how many people they think it'd affect, to what extent, how much money it could save them. And the reason, by the way, it hasn't come, or at least the reason they are giving, is that it is tied to this spring statement, and crucially, the publication from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent sort of number crunchers, because it plays into all of that and the various scorecards and numbers that we'll get next week.
But there will be things in that are, things like the child poverty rate. I think the MPs will be paying quite a lot of
completely.
attention to. So if it looks like the child poverty has actually gone up, that will obviously be, despite what I was saying, that will be politically consequential, I think.
But also, there was reporting on Wednesday night that there will be more spending cuts from the Chancellor next week at the spring statement. So what are you hearing? What are you hearing, Lucy, about that?
Well, certainly the government not denying reports that last October, when we had the budget, the spending envelope was predicted to rise on average across Whitehall 1.3% annually after this next year. We think that's going to go down potentially to 1.1%. When you take out protected departments like health, like defence, that could be cuts of up to 7% for some of the departments.
I'm just having a feeling of déjà vu.
Well, quite. And, you're talking about déjà vu because we had that era of austerity under the coalition government. These would be additional cuts that come on top of those cuts. There isn't much fat to be removed from departments like local government, like justice. We all know the courts and prisons are on their knees in many senses. So it looks like it could be a very painful statement for Rachel Reeves next week politically, because it does feel like potentially a return to austerity. And that's exactly what Labour promised it wouldn't do in the lead up to the election.
And I think they're going to, aware of that charge that will come, I think they'll try and make two arguments. One is that they'll say, look at how much money we have thrown into capital spending, longer term investment that was announced at the last budget. So they'll certainly have a run at that. I've actually forgotten what my second point was, so I'll defer to Stephanie if you pick up, and maybe it'll come back to me.
Well, I'm trying to think of their second point now. I guess one thing you could point out, though, is this was that spending squeeze was inherent in the numbers months ago. Actually, when she did her first budget. So even with all that tax raising, we could see that coming down the track was going to be this really tough spending round. I think the focus has been, rightly or wrongly, on this whole question of what she was going to have to do to keep to her fiscal rules. I think to some extent, with the welfare cuts, and oddly with the shift into defence spending, she's kind of dodged a bullet on that, because we think she could still quite, not easily, but having with the move cutting. This is one of those weird bits of how they look at economic statistics. Somehow saving lives through economic development assistance is considered to be current spending.
Yes.
But, spending money on maybe killing people in the future, that's investment. So she's
because
actually
it takes time,
reduced.
as discussed.
She's actually reduced the amount of day-to-day spending just by doing that, by a handy couple of billion, and she's done the welfare cut. So we think she's looking at similar kind of headroom, which was still quite low, but she will come away without having to do a lot extra on spending, which at least will count as a win, even though it's looking very tough.
And I think for that reason, they will try and point to the total as opposed to the two things to try and push back against that argument around austerity. And I have just remembered that point that I was flailing around for, which is that tomorrow, next Wednesday will be spending heavy, not tax.
Right.
So, and I hear there's a bit of a flurry yesterday of, will there be a announcement that the thresholds for taxes, which have been frozen for ages, and plenty call it a stealth tax because more people get dragged into higher rates of paying income tax, could those freezes remain towards the tail end of this Parliament when the Chancellor had said that they wouldn't? I am told that there won't be anything in terms of tweaking that.
Though I suspect we'll be talking about that every single budget for the next years. It's the thing that's waiting to be done.
Indeed.
But there's also one other thing, there's a word that hangs in the air over all of this, and it's growth. This Labour government was elected promising growth, promising a turnaround, promising an end to years of stagnation of the UK economy. And without that, is it not the case that all of this is just going to get harder and harder and harder?
Well, yes, in a word, and that's what we're going to be all poring over next Wednesday. Expected downgrade to the growth forecasts. We know the interest rates have been higher than expected, which has made the cost of servicing public debt higher, which is one reason we think there's been this slight reduction we're expecting in the Chancellor's headroom, which necessitates the cuts across Whitehall that we were just discussing. But absolutely, it is the preeminent mission of the 5 missions of this government. It is necessary for them to achieve most of the other missions, which involve growing the economy to have more money to channel into public services like health, education, tackling crime. And even by Rachel Reeves' own sort of strategy of, the capital investment she unveiled in the budget last autumn, which she said was designed to sort of crowd in private investment. The Office for Budget Responsibility actually warned it looked like it was crowding out private investment. So I think there are question marks about her strategy. And that's where we get to anti-business measures.
And this has been the big disappointment that's underpinned the last 6 months. And we shouldn't forget, and it does actually hang over next week, because if the Office for Budget Responsibility decides that this economic weakness in the last 6 months or so is actually permanent and reflects a kind of lasting problem, continued problem with our potential, that would be a whole other ballgame in terms of tens of billions of pounds on the borrowing.
Is there another scenario where we look back on this period at the next general election and say, actually, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and the other members of the cabinet were quietly fixing things under the bonnet in a technocratic way that hasn't grabbed a lot of headlines, such as clearing the way for planning reforms, that will have led to growth by the time of the next election? Like, is it too early for us to be saying, this is a disaster for this government?
Yes, is the short answer to that. But then who knows how all of those things turn out in the next few years and the extent to which there's a kind of, legitimate criticism or not in the eyes of the electorate. One of the phrase I think we're going to hear a lot of next week, which will be thrown around as a way of justifying whatever we hear from the Chancellor, and we've got a reasonable sense of what might be coming, is the world has changed. That'll be the overall framing around how things are now compared with where they were in October, even though it wasn't unreasonable back in October to say, look at the way you've sliced and diced things and your own imposed rules and the headroom you've left yourself. And it wouldn't be that surprising if come 6 months' time you're going to have to shimmy around a bit.
Lucy, thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
Stephanie, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, always good to see you.
Cheers, James.
And that's it from this episode of Newscast. Bye-bye.